I want to start this video with an honest admission. I don't fully know the answer to the question in the title. I'm going to walk you through what I did, what it cost me, and what I gained, and I'm going to let you draw your own conclusion, because 2 years later, I still draw a different one depending on the day. At 70 years old, 4 months after my wife Ruth passed, I sold the house we'd lived in for 38 years, sold or donated nearly everything inside it, and moved alone to the Philippines with 2 suitcases and a decision my children still, gently, question. I've thought about that decision almost every single day since. Not always with regret, not always with certainty either. I want to give you the honest, unresolved version of this story, because I think the resolved, triumphant versions of these videos leave out something important. Sometimes you make a significant decision and simply have to keep living inside the uncertainty of whether it was right.
Ruth and I were married 44 years. She was a nurse for 30 of those years. I spent 31 as a public school principal. The kind of career that fills your calendar so completely, you don't notice how much of your identity depends on it until it stops.
She died of a stroke. Sudden. On an ordinary Wednesday morning while I was at the grocery store buying nothing more significant than bread and coffee. I came home to find her on the kitchen floor. I won't describe more of that morning than that, because I don't think the details serve this story, only that it changed the entire shape of everything that came after, in a single, unannounced moment.
The 4 months that followed are, honestly, still somewhat blurred in my memory. I remember specific fragments more than a coherent timeline. The funeral, my daughter staying with me for the first 2 weeks, a grief support group I attended exactly once and never returned to because I found the group setting more isolating than helpful. What I remember most clearly is the house itself, suddenly enormous, every room holding some specific evidence of 44 years I could no longer bear looking at directly. I want to be honest that this decision, unlike some of the more carefully researched stories you might have seen, was not the product of months of methodical planning. I made it in about 3 weeks, which I recognize, even now, was fast for a decision of this size. A former colleague from my school district had retired to the Philippines 2 years earlier, and we'd stayed loosely in touch. I called him, mostly just to talk to someone who wasn't managing my grief for me, and somewhere in that conversation, almost offhandedly, he mentioned that his own transition had given him something he hadn't expected. Not happiness exactly, but forward motion, a sense that his life still had a next chapter, rather than simply continuing to exist inside the last one. I booked a one-way flight 9 days later. I didn't do the 4-month research process some other retirees describe. I didn't take an exploratory visit first. I sold the house within 6 weeks to a young family, eager to move in quickly, distributed most of our furniture and belongings to my children, a few close friends, and a local charity, and left the country I'd lived in my entire life, with 2 suitcases and considerably less preparation than I now, with 2 years of hindsight, would recommend to anyone else.
I've asked myself many times since why I moved with so little deliberation, and I think the honest answer is uncomfortable but worth saying plainly. I wasn't running towards something. I was running away from a house that had become unbearable, and the specific destination mattered less, in that moment, than the fact of leaving.
My son, in particular, worried about exactly this distinction at the time. He asked me directly, the week before I left, whether I was making a decision or simply fleeing a feeling, and whether those were actually different things when made this quickly. I didn't have a good answer for him then. I'm not sure I have a complete one now, 2 years later. What I can say is that the speed of the decision was, itself, a kind of honesty about where I was emotionally. A more careful, 4-month research process might have produced a more informed outcome. It also might have given the grief more time to talk me out of leaving at all, trapping me in that house for another year, watching every room continue to hold Ruth's absence without any forward motion whatsoever. I don't know which version would have served me better. I genuinely don't. The first months were difficult, in ways that went beyond ordinary culture shock, because I was navigating an unfamiliar country, while still, simultaneously, navigating fresh grief I hadn't finished processing before I left.
I remember sitting in my small apartment during my 3rd week,
unable to identify whether a specific wave of sadness was about missing Ruth or about the disorientation of an unfamiliar place. The two griefs tangled together so completely that I couldn't separate them even to understand what I actually needed in that moment.
My former colleague, the one whose phone call had prompted this whole decision, checked on me regularly during those early weeks, and I'm grateful for that in a way that's hard to fully express. But even his kindness couldn't fully address the core problem, which was that I'd left one form of isolation, a quiet house full of grief, and initially found myself in another form entirely, an unfamiliar country full of the same grief, simply relocated rather than resolved. I want to be honest that there were specific nights, maybe 6 or 7, scattered across that first 2 months, where I genuinely considered booking a return flight, not out of dislike for the country itself, but out of a growing suspicion that I'd made a significant, possibly irreversible decision while not remotely in a stable enough emotional state to make one well. What eventually shifted wasn't a single dramatic turning point, but a slow accumulation of small, ordinary moments that gradually gave the move its own independent value, separate from the grief that had originally prompted it. My former colleague introduced me, around the 2-month mark, to a small group of retired teachers and administrators, both American expats and local educators, who met monthly to discuss, of all things, education policy and reform, a genuinely substantive discussion group, rather than simple socializing, which appealed directly to 31 years of professional identity I hadn't realized I still needed an outlet for. I also started, almost by accident, tutoring a neighbor's grandson in English composition twice a week. A small, unpaid arrangement that began when the boy's mother mentioned, in passing, that he was struggling in school. Something about standing in front of a single struggling student again, applying 31 years of educational instinct to a genuinely specific, solvable problem, gave me a version of purpose I hadn't expected to find again this quickly. By the 4-month mark, roughly the same amount of time that had originally elapsed between Ruth's death and my departure, I noticed something specific. I was thinking about Ruth with warmth more often than with the raw, disorienting grief that had defined those first 4 months back home. I don't think that shift happened because of geography specifically. I think it happened because time had simply continued to pass, the way it does regardless of where you're standing when it does. But I also don't think the new environment, the tutoring, the discussion group, hurt that process. I think they gave the passing time somewhere useful to land. About 6 months in, my daughter called and asked me, plainly, whether I regretted the decision. I told her the truth, which surprised her, I think, more than a simple yes or no would have. I told her I didn't fully know. I told her that some days, the isolation of having left everyone who'd known me and Ruth together felt like a genuine loss, a specific kind of loneliness that no amount of new friendship in the Philippines could fully replace. I told her that other days, the forward motion the move had given me, the tutoring, the discussion group, the simple fact of a life that felt like it was continuing rather than merely persisting, felt like the only thing that had actually helped in those first difficult months.
She was quiet for a while on the phone, then said something I've thought about often since. Dad, I think you're allowed to not fully know. I think we want you to have a clean answer, because it would make us feel better about supporting the decision.
But maybe there isn't one. I found that more comforting than any reassurance she could have offered, because it gave me permission to stop searching for a certainty I didn't actually feel. I want to describe, specifically, what I've genuinely gained over these 2 years, because I don't want the honest uncertainty of this story to obscure real, tangible benefits. The tutoring arrangement grew into something larger. I now work with 4 students, still unpaid, still informal, but structured enough that I've effectively rebuilt a small piece of my old professional identity in an entirely new context. The education discussion group has become a genuine friendship circle. 6 of us now, meeting monthly but also, increasingly, simply for dinner without any formal agenda. My finances, modest as a former principal's pension is, stretch considerably further here than they would have back home, giving me a level of day-to-day comfort I hadn't fully budgeted for when I made this decision quickly and without much financial planning. I've started, in the past year, taking a weekly Tagalog class, partly for practical reasons and partly because learning something new at 72 has given me a specific kind of engagement I don't think I would have sought out as deliberately back home, surrounded by too much familiarity to feel any real need to stretch myself. I also want to be honest about what leaving cost me, because I think that honesty matters more than a purely triumphant conclusion.
I missed my granddaughter's high school graduation last year. A specific, irreplaceable moment I can never get back, because the flight and timing simply didn't align with my finances and existing commitments here.
I've missed countless smaller moments too. Ordinary Sunday dinners, a nephew's wedding, the specific texture of being physically present for my children's ordinary lives, rather than experiencing them through video calls and photographs. I also lost something harder to name. The specific, irreplaceable comfort of grieving Ruth in the town where we'd actually lived our life together, near the cemetery where she's buried, surrounded by people who'd known her directly, rather than only through my descriptions of her. There are days I feel that loss acutely, wondering whether processing grief in an entirely unfamiliar environment, however ultimately helpful the forward motion proved to be, cost me some deeper, slower form of healing I might have found by simply staying and enduring the difficult months in the place where our actual life had happened. 14 months in, I had a health scare, a fall resulting in a wrist fracture, nothing life-threatening, but enough to genuinely test whether the support system I'd built here could actually function in a real emergency, alone, without family nearby. The medical care itself was excellent, affordable, and handled entirely in English without any communication difficulty. But the specific loneliness of recovering from an injury without my children physically present, relying instead on the discussion group friends and my former colleague to handle logistics I would once have relied on family for, was harder than I expected, even with genuinely kind people stepping in to help. My daughter flew out during that recovery, her first visit, and I watched her process something complicated during that trip. Relief that I had real, functioning support here, alongside continued worry about what would happen during a more serious future emergency without her nearby. She didn't resolve that worry during the visit, and I don't think she's fully resolved it since. I don't think I have either. So, was I wrong? I want to give you my honest answer, which is that I don't think wrong is actually the right word for what I'm trying to evaluate. The decision gave me genuine forward motion during the hardest 4 months of my life. Motion I'm not certain I would have found staying in that house alone. It also cost me physical presence for specific, irreplaceable family moments I can never fully recover. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I've stopped expecting one to cancel out the other into a single clean verdict.
I think what I actually regret isn't the decision to leave, but the speed at which I made it. 3 weeks. Not enough time to build the kind of support infrastructure that might have softened both the early isolation and the later challenges of managing a health scare alone.
If I could redo this, I think I'd take the same fundamental decision, but extend the timeline. Build more infrastructure before departing. Visit once before committing permanently, the way some other retirees in similar stories have described doing more carefully than I did.
If you're considering a similar decision, especially in the aftermath of a significant loss, here's what 2 years of genuinely uncertain hindsight have taught me.
Grief and geography are not the same problem. Even though they can feel entangled in the early months, moving somewhere new can provide genuine forward motion, but it won't resolve grief on its own timeline, and you should expect both processes to continue happening simultaneously, sometimes indistinguishably, for longer than you might hope. If possible, don't move as quickly as I did. 3 weeks was, I now believe, too fast, not because the destination was wrong, but because the infrastructure I eventually built, the discussion group, the tutoring, the friendships that helped both my grief and my sense of purpose, could have existed before I left, rather than being built entirely from scratch in an unfamiliar place, while still actively grieving. Build what you can in advance. Visit first, if your circumstances allow it. Give yourself more runway. I don't know if I'll ever have a fully resolved answer to the question in this video's title, and I've made a kind of peace with that unresolved state that I don't think I could have predicted 2 years ago. I think about Ruth daily, here, in a small apartment she never saw, surrounded by a life she never knew, and I've come to believe that missing her hasn't diminished simply because I moved. It's simply found a different shape here than it would have found in that house. I don't know which shape would have hurt less, or healed better, or honored her more completely. I only know the shape I actually have, built from the decision I actually made. If you're facing a similar decision, in grief or otherwise, I don't think I can tell you whether to make the leap I made. I can only tell you that 2 years later, I'm still here, still uncertain some days, still genuinely grateful other days, and still, honestly, unsure whether those two feelings are ever meant to fully resolve into one clean answer. If you've faced something similar, I'd like to hear how you've made peace, or haven't, with your own version of this uncertainty. I'll see you in the next one. I wrote something about 8 months ago that I haven't shared with my children, and I want to share part of it here, because I think it explains something about this decision that the rest of the story hasn't fully captured. It was a letter to Ruth, written late one night after a difficult conversation with my son about the wrist fracture and what might happen if something more serious occurred. I don't often write letters to a person who's gone, and I felt a little foolish starting it, but something about that particular night made the exercise feel necessary rather than sentimental. I told her about the apartment, about the tutoring, about the discussion group she would have found either baffling or delightful. I could never quite decide which. I told her I still didn't know if leaving the house had been the right decision, and that I suspected she would have had a clearer opinion about it than I've managed to form myself in 2 years of living inside the actual consequences. I told her, too, about a specific thing I hadn't said out loud to anyone else. That some part of me had left, partly because staying in that house without her had started to feel like a museum exhibit of a life, rather than an actual continuation of one, and that I wasn't sure whether leaving had been brave or simply a different kind of running than the one my son had originally worried about. I ended the letter the way I ended most conversations with her for 44 years, mid-thought, assuming there would be more time to finish it later. There wasn't, this time either, not because anything happened, but because I simply didn't know how to conclude an argument I was still actively having with myself. I still don't. The letter sits, unfinished, in a drawer beside my passport, and I take it out occasionally, not to finish it, but because rereading an unfinished thought feels, somehow, more honest than forcing a tidy ending onto something that genuinely doesn't have one yet.
I also wrote something in that letter about the house itself, the one we'd shared for 38 years, now owned by a young family I've never met, and likely never will.
I told her I hoped they were filling it with the kind of ordinary noise we once filled it with. School mornings, arguments about nothing, the specific chaos of raising children in rooms that later became unbearably quiet once those children grew and left, and then, eventually, once she left too. I found myself, writing that part, genuinely hoping the house was happy again, in whatever way a house can be said to hold happiness, separate from whichever of its former occupants happened to still be alive to feel it. I want to end with something more recent, because I think it captures where things actually stand better than any of my own reflection could. My son called last week, an ordinary Tuesday call, nothing prompted by any anniversary or crisis. Partway through, almost offhandedly, he mentioned that he and his wife had been talking about their own retirement, still 15 years away, and that watching what I'd built here, however uncertain I remained about the original decision, had genuinely changed how they thought about their own eventual choices. "Dad," he said, "I used to think you either made the right call or the wrong one, and I kept waiting for you to land on which. I don't think that anymore. I think you built something real out of a decision that started messy, and maybe that's just what a real decision actually looks like once you stop expecting it to feel clean." I didn't have a quick response to that. I sat with it for a while after we hung up, the way I've sat with most of the harder parts of this story. I think he's right, though I'm not sure I could have articulated it myself as clearly as he did. I think I've spent 2 years looking for a verdict on a decision that was never actually built to produce one. Not because I chose poorly, and not because I chose perfectly, but because some decisions simply don't resolve into a single answer, however long you wait for one to arrive. I still don't know if I was wrong. I've stopped expecting to know. What I do know is that 2 years in, I have a tutoring schedule, a monthly discussion group, a weekly Tagalog class, a drawer with an unfinished letter to my wife, and a son who called me last Tuesday just to talk. Whatever verdict this decision eventually deserves, I think that's a reasonably honest account of what it actually produced. I asked him, before we hung up, whether he thought his grandmother, Ruth, would have understood the decision better than the rest of us managed to. He laughed, a little, and said, "Dad, Grandma packed a suitcase and drove to Atlanta alone the week after her own mother died, back before any of us were born, just because she said the house needed to stop being the only thing she looked at. I think she'd have understood you perfectly. I think she might have been a little proud you finally did something that impulsive yourself. Honestly, after 44 years of you being the careful one in that marriage." I hadn't heard that story about Ruth before. Or if I had, I'd forgotten it somewhere along the way, buried under 4 decades of more ordinary memories. It struck me, hearing it now, that maybe this impulse hadn't come from nowhere after all. Maybe some part of what I actually inherited from 44 years beside her wasn't caution, the trait I'd always assumed defined our marriage, but this, the specific, occasionally reckless courage to leave a room that had stopped being livable, and trust that livable would eventually be rebuilt somewhere else. Thank you for sitting with this uncertainty alongside me. I'll see you in the next one.